Hi there, everyone. Welcome to the video lecture for the next unit in the Religion, Race, and Ethnicity course on Judaism and anti-Semitism. In this video lecture, I'm going to offer a survey of the Jewish tradition that goes along with the RRE chapter, and also focus in on, in keeping with our central themes in the course, focus in on myths of identity and difference that come out of the Bible and prove to be really instrumental and formative within Judaism, not only Judaism, but Western culture in general. So you'll probably recognize some of these touchstones that I'll be talking about today. So I will share some slides with you here. Here we go. We have some key questions before us in this unit of the course. And you see here a quote from Neusner, where he offers a kind of definition that's attempting to capture the complexity of ethnicity and religion when it comes to the case of Judaism. And we want to ask ourselves, what exactly is the difference between Judaism and as a religion and Jewishness as an ethnic identity? And of course, we're going to find that it's rather hard to separate these two things. Neusner tries to capture these two elements by talking about people who are Judaists, right, who are basically what we call religious Jews, and being Jewish or a Jew as a broader category, as an ethnic category. One can be Jewish, right, but not subscribe to the religious components, the more religious components, if we by religion mean engaging in ritual practice or certain kinds of beliefs like believing in God. There are plenty of Jewish people who are agnostic or atheist and don't participate in any of the rituals, et cetera, et cetera. That's an interesting case, and surely is different in a number of ways from the Muslim and Christian cases, where you can't really call yourself a Muslim and swear off, unless you're a Sufi or something like that, and swear off the pillars of Islam and ritual practice and say that Allah doesn't exist and say that Jesus Christ is not your Lord and Savior and was just a human being or something along those lines, and call yourself a Christian doesn't really work. So we have an interesting case here, and we'll be investigating that complex intersection. We also want to return to our constant theme in the class, namely the tension between universalism and Judaism and particularism. And once again, that means when it comes to universalism, a religion's proneness or tendency to urge a kind of commonality of humanity, a transcendence of difference, a moving beyond individual, racial, ethnic difference, right? A vision of a kind of equality or commonality. Those are universalist sentiments. And particularist sentiments are about the opposite, constraining identity or restricting identity. Religion often serves that function. In the Jewish case, we have the idea of the Jewish people as the chosen people and the God of Judaism as the God of those people in particular. So we, again, have that tension between universalist sensibilities and particularism, as we'll see. And also, we want to see how all those myths of identity or the idea of identity intertwines with this motif of exile and return, which is the central theme in Protheros chapter. This is a broad kind of time frame for the development of the Jewish tradition. The Judaism we have come to know today is not the same Judaism as practiced back in the first millennium, first BCE, and the tradition has undergone significant historical developments over time. And we will obviously not focus on the details of each of these periods, but we will hit some of the high points. So a good starting point, an early source, right, for the primordial history, or say mythic period, using that term in the way that we're thinking about it in this class, is of course the Bible. The generic term for this text is the Hebrew Bible. Within the tradition, it's often referred to as Torah, more generally. or Tanakh, which is an acronym made of three different categories of texts within this anthology, within the biblical collection. Torah most specifically refers to the first five books of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible. And then you see that there are these other categories, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, in the text. And so T and K, they're taken to make an acronym, namely Tanakh, and that's sometimes how the Bible is referred to in the Jewish tradition. So let's return to the beginning, and you probably will recognize this story, whether you're religious or not. It is the beginning of Genesis 1, and I won't read all these biblical verses to you. You can pause and read them yourself if you'd like. This is a depiction of a seemingly universal God who creates all of creation, right, by separating things out, by taking this raw material and starting to order it, separating out land from water and light from darkness, etc. So this God is in the beginnings kind of organizing things, right, and setting the ground rules. And when this God gets to creating living creatures, there's an initial differentiation between humanity and animals. And in fact, the difference here is hierarchical, and that's often the way these myths work. You make a difference, the myth establishes a difference, and then establishes a hierarchy. And here that's very explicit, humankind given dominion over all of the animals and creatures on the earth. And then what about differences among human beings? Well, if this creation myth were going to institute from the very beginning differences between groups or types of people, races, ethnicities, nations, etc., this would be a good place to do it. This is in Genesis 1, right at the very beginning. But the only difference that's introduced here is actually gender, which is kind of interesting. Gender is the primordial difference, and the text at this point anyway does not mention differences between groupings of people. Obviously, these verses about when it comes to gender have had a long, very complex, very influential, and according to some, very controversial history. This is not a class on religion and gender, but you can imagine and probably know about the implications of these verses, and they're complex in their core, right? They're not completely straightforward when you have God creating humankind in his image, but male and female, he creating them in his image. A lot to think about there. Anyway, as the narrative unfolds, this male and female, Adam and Eve, are ultimately make a mistake and are expelled from the Garden of Eden, and are thus, this is therefore the original exile in the story of exile and return. Human beings expelled right from their paradise because of a mistake that they make. In Christian circles, this is the origin of what's often called original sin, marking all humanity as sinful in our essential nature from the very beginning. Not quite like that in Judaism. We kind of start out at a zero level, and then we can make decisions to turn towards God, right, and turn towards what's holy and what's good, or we can make the decision, we can be tempted to make the decision to turn away from God and turn towards sin. But this is not a be-all, end-all condition that is a condition of sinfulness. There's always the opportunity for redemption and return. And much of the biblical narrative, and indeed one might say much of Judaism, is about the effort to return after making mistakes, right? To conform oneself to God and what God has ordained through agreements with humanity after making mistakes. So this situation in the garden is maybe not quite as, say, dramatic. It's emblematic, certainly it's symbolic, but it's not quite as dramatic as we find in some circles where this marks us forever with a sin that we just can't resolve for ourselves. We move into the uh, the heart of the biblical narrative as Adam and Eve have children and start to pass along their legacy through this lineage. Um, in this story, we have a sibling rivalry between Cain and Abel, and you can read over it and its details. Basically, um, God kind of stirs the pot a little bit and favors what Abel has to offer him at the expense of his brother Cain. Cain gets jealous, kills Abel. God calls Cain out um, and exiles Cain, but Cain laments this fact, and God, interestingly enough, puts a mark on him, um, the mark of Cain, which is a kind of symbol of God's protection. So it's kind of weird back and forth. God curses him to exile, but then protects him against being killed by anybody who he encounters. The mark of Cain is a very controversial mythic element in this story, and as we'll see, been used in a whole variety of ways to promote racist ideas, um, either as the marker of God's protection of a certain group of people um, who eventually are identified as white people by white supremacist myths. Um, Similarly, white supremacist myths have also used the mark of Cain to associate a mark with color, colored skin, and thus associate all colored people, right, with this initial mistake or curse that's visited upon Cain. So this is a very early part of the biblical story that's later interpreted in the service of racist ideas down the road, as we will see. Um, in this story, as we move along in the biblical narrative, we have another story about identity and difference, where humanity is uh, united in purpose. Everyone speaks the same language and seems to have the same ambition, and they all decide to build these great towers up to the heavens, up to the realm of God Himself, and God does not look too kindly on that and decides to undermine this whole enterprise by giving everybody different languages. They don't understand each other and they can't work together, which is a myth of origin explaining human differentiation on a crucial ethnic level, namely at the level of language. Moving on, we arrive at the flood narrative, and we know that the flood itself is an episode of differentiation because God decides to flood the world because humanity has become wicked and evil, and he decides to do a reboot. And he decides to try to do that reboot by bringing along a primordial family and rescuing them from this flood, a primordial human family, and then also primordial families, pairings of animals so they can repopulate the earth after all this has happened. What the poor animals all over the world have done to deserve this fate is kind of unclear, and God himself kind of in the Bible seems to kind of regret that himself. And in the end of this whole thing, the flood narrative says he's not going to do this again. Um, so there are interesting wrinkles to this particular story. For our purposes, we want to flash forward to the aftermath of the flood. And here we have this kind of bizarre episode where Noah, and once again, you can pause here if you want to read the text itself, where Noah, who's been rescued, now celebrates the fact that he and his family made it through the flood. And Noah grows a vineyard, rapidly ferments some wine, drinks it, celebrates a little bit too hard, and falls down drunk in his tent with his tunic or whatever, revealing himself in all of his glory. And one of his 3 sons, Ham, goes in and sees his father naked and goes outside and tells his brothers. And the brothers go in and I guess do the thing you were supposed to do if you see your drunk father naked. carry a garment backwards without looking at him and drop it on him, right? So his nakedness is covered. So when Noah wakes up, probably not in the best mood, he realizes somehow what has happened to him, and he curses his son and his son's son, right? So he curses Ham and his son Canaan, right? And he curses him to be a slave to the other brothers, he and all of his progeny, right? Out into the future to be servants or slaves of the other two brothers, right? Shem and Japheth. And so this curse is visited upon Ham and then Canaan and anybody else, right, who is the progeny of Ham and Canaan on through the centuries. Here we have a crucial differentiation between brothers in this mythic story, but then the text takes the next step and says, okay, so who were these people who proceeded from Ham and then Canaan, right? And here are those peoples, right? The descendants of Ham are these people from Cush, Egypt, Put, Canaan itself, the land Canaan now, right? Um, and all of these people are tribes, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, etc. These are all people, actual people, historical people who are in the world at the time of the composition of the Bible. And these people spread abroad, right? And their territory is expansive and includes cities like places like Gaza, right? Sodom and Gomorrah. These are recognizable names, right? These places were all populated by the progeny of Canaan. Remember, the cursed progeny of Canaan were destined to be servants of the others who were cursed, right, by Noah. So hold that thought for just a moment. We want to move over to another myth of identity that comes later in Genesis. This is the story of Abram or Abraham, and we've run into this story before in talking about Islam. Now, you remember in Islam, Abraham has two sons, Ishmael and then Isaac. The first son is the son of Abraham and Hagar, his wife's servant, right? And because Sarah is not able to give Abraham a child, a son, and an heir, he urges Hagar to go to Abraham, and she conceives a son, namely Ishmael. But then later, miraculously, Sarah does have a son, namely Isaac, and she gets upset and says, kick Ishmael and Hagar out of the house. And in Islam, that's where we pick up the story of the origin of Islam, the mythic origin of Islam, and the origins of the Arab people, right, in Arabia. But in the biblical story, the lineage picks up from Isaac, right? Um, Abraham does kick out Hagar and Ishmael, right? They go off in their own direction. They're not really followed anymore in the Hebrew Bible. Isaac becomes the one who is the inheritor of the lineage, the connection that Abraham has with God. And the story goes in the direction of Isaac, right? So this is just rounding out that picture that we previewed when we talked about the Muslim tradition. Two different sons who become the forebears of two different people and ultimately two different religions going off in different directions, at least according to this mythic origin. Not that Ishmael ends up with a terrible fate or is cursed or something like that. In this particular story, he grows up, lives in the wilderness, is an expert with a bow, lives in the wilderness, got a mother and wife in the land of Egypt. But notice all of this is connected with that kind of Canaanite group of people, right? Isaac is in the lineage, following in the lineage of the covenant of Abraham. according to the biblical narrative. We move up to another crucial episode which enshrines the idea of exile and return in the Bible, namely the Exodus story. God says, responding to the bondage of the Hebrews in Egypt, and we know that Egypt is connected, right, with that group of people who are associated with that original curse of Canaan, of Ham and Canaan from the Noah story. No, I know the sufferings of my people, and now I'm going to deliver them from the Egyptians and bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, flowing with milk and honey, that's currently occupied by, guess who? Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, all of the group of people who were the ones who came from the cursed sons, Ham and Canaan. Right? So that's their destination, the destination of the people in exile in Egypt. When when Moses asks God, right, who his identity is, he says a couple of interesting things that are maybe kind of in tension with each other. He says, I am who I am. That is, I don't have a name. I'm just God. I'm just being, universal being, right? Above all, like that God of Genesis 1, the universal God. And then God says, you should also say that I'm the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. So the particular God connected with this group of community, these leaders, these prophets, these patriarchs, I'm that God. So there, right, in those two lines, you have this tension between a universal God, I am who I am, and a particular God, the God of a particular group of people, the God of your ancestors, just in the space of a couple of lines in the Bible. As you know, Moses does rescue the people from Pharaoh after some pretty serious violence visited upon the Egyptians, right? The firstborn sons are killed in the final plague, final curse that's placed on the Egyptian people. And then Pharaoh and his armies are washed away in the Dead Sea, enabling the Hebrew people to escape into their wandering in Sinai. They wander for a while, and then they return to the Promised Land. Well, in the middle of this, there's something very important that Prothero highlights, the giving of the law. The narrative to this point really leads up to this moment, and this is the climactic moment in the biblical story, in the Torah. The narrative leads up to Moses giving the law to the people, and most of the rest of Torah is actually devoted to exploring the law and what the law's implications are for the people. But then they arrive at the Promised Land, the land of Canaan, that land of milk and honey. And here I'm just putting it in geographical perspective for you. And as predicted, quote unquote predicted, or retrojected into the Bible, there are people who are already living there. And this is what the Bible says you are supposed to do with those people who are already living in Canaan, in the Promised Land. You can make peace with them. If they refuse to make peace, however, put to the sword all the men in the cities in the Promised Land that you encounter. Take the women, the children, plunder them as you want. This is how you should treat all the cities that are at a distance from you and do not belong to the nations nearby. Completely destroy them, and notice who these people are. Completely destroy them: Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, right, as the Lord commanded you. So in the Exodus narrative, we have vengeance visited upon the Egyptians, and then we have conquest and plunder visited upon the peoples of Canaan. And those peoples of Canaan have been linked all throughout the narrative to the original curse after the flood, connected to that myth, post flood myth of the son of Noah doing wrong by his father and then getting cursed to be a servant and slave of the progeny of the other two brothers, who are the Hebrews in this case. And here's a quick diagram of this narrative that I've just charted out, where we go from this curse, right, through the establishment of the Canaanite peoples, right, the exile in Egypt, which also positions Egyptians as the enemy, the arrival in the Promised Land, conquest of the Canaanites ordained by the biblical text in Deuteronomy, their destruction, and the founding of Israel historically. So what we have here is a very complex network, right, of identity and difference, which ratifies the destruction of certain groups of people because their curse goes all the way back almost basically to the beginning, right? An original curse mythically established in the biblical text that runs through all of these people and warrants behavior later in time, enables behavior later in time. And that is directly in keeping with our definition of myth and curse. Once the Promised Land gets settled, David is the military leader who clears out all of these people. And we're talking now about 1000 before the Common Era, and a history that becomes a bit more recordable in terms of the text and the sources for it. David, the Messiah, the Redeemer, and the Savior of the Jewish people, who has been anointed by God to serve this role, hands off to his son Solomon, who's actually able to build the temple in Jerusalem that's going to be the conduit for worship of the God of these people, that God, I am who I am, the God, the creator of all of the universe. This is a reconstruction, imagined reconstruction of that first temple established right around 1000 before the Common Era. There's a lot of tension. The Promised Land is not all it's cracked up to be. Temple worship is moving along, but the people are tempted to stray away from the message, especially the core monotheistic message of Judaism. There are outside invaders who are members of all of those tribes who are still remaining outside of Israel and Judah. They attack the people. The kingdom is cut in half, leaving only the region of Jerusalem intact. And even that in the 5th century of the Common Era is ultimately, or the 6th century rather, is ultimately destroyed. A king called Nebuchadnezzar from the Babylonian Empire comes along and destroys the temple, plunders Jerusalem, and takes many of the elites of Israelite society, many elite members of the Hebrew community, into exile in Babylon. He kidnaps them and makes them servants. This is obviously a complete and utter disaster for the Jewish tradition, a real historical exile that takes place, and then there's a return. Cyrus the Great, who is the Persian king from the next kingdom over, comes to Babylon, takes Babylon over, right, and then frees the Jewish people and sends them back to their homeland to rebuild. You can see the geography here in this map on the right. Mesopotamia, Babylon, further to the east would have been Persia. Now, what's important about this period is this is the period, because the temple is destroyed, that scholars think that a lot of the Bible was pulled together. The stories, the texts were there, but it wasn't all pulled together in a unifying narrative. The historical experience of exile and return in the Babylonian exile, right, instigated by Nebuchadnezzar and ended by Cyrus the Great, puts its imprint on the Bible. That experience, direct experience of being exiled from the homeland, brought to another place for several decades, and then liberated and returned by Cyrus the Great, who was thought to be the instrument of God, actually, even though he's not Jewish at all, imprints the idea of exile and return on the Jewish tradition and Jewish history. And here you have another geographic reference for how this might have gone. And we move on to the rebuilding period, and the temple was rebuilt grander than ever, the Second Temple. This is the Second Temple today, or what's left of it, the Western Wall. And obviously, this is a holy place for Judaism, and it's a site of pilgrimage for Jews from the world over. And you notice what's on top of the Temple Mount, not the Second Temple, because as we'll see in a moment, it's no longer there, but instead a mosque. And that mosque is the third holiest site within Islam, again, connecting with our previous unit. It's the place where Muhammad made his night journey up to heaven to commune with the prophets and ultimately with Allah. From the Temple Mount, the very place where the Second Temple used to be in Jerusalem, which was the most sacred place for Jews of that time and remains very sacred to this day. So complicated intermingling of these traditions here. In 70 of the Common Era, we have yet another instance of conquest and exile, and in certain ways, the most long-lasting of them. When the Romans come to Judea, as they called it, after a period of considerable strife, which has a number of Jewish factions and entities rebelling against the Roman Empire, the occupation of the Roman Empire, engaging in guerrilla warfare and what we might call terrorist acts against the Roman Empire to try to get them to leave. In the midst of all that, a Jewish preacher comes along who may or may not have had a political agenda, depending on who you talk to, an individual named Jesus, who, as part of all this chaos and turmoil, is crucified by the Romans in somewhere around 30, 31, 32 of the Common Era. This chaos goes on for several decades until in 70 of the Common Era, the Romans are tired of it. They go into Jerusalem, they sack the city, they destroy the temple, they disperse all the people, they drive them out, and end, in effect, the period of rebellion, and end Jewish identity as it has been come to be known up to that point. There's no more temple. The people are dispersed all throughout the Mediterranean. They had already been dispersed, right? There have been people all over the place in the Roman Empire, but now there's no homeland. And so this really changes the face of Judaism and transforms it. The focus becomes following the law as dictated in the Torah and as interpreted by teachers or rabbis, such that anywhere you are, you can be in compliance and follow the will of God through understanding properly what the Torah is telling you to do, day in, day out, in every action. And also an institution called the synagogue, which is really just kind of a meeting place, which is not a temple. It's a temple led by priests. It's really just a place for Jews to convene and come together and connect with God and connect with community. These are two crucial institutions that arise as a result of this diaspora, which literally means spreading of the people, and really is the contemporary shape of Judaism in most of the instances that you find it, even in Israel. We see here the continuing spread of the Jewish people throughout Europe and throughout the Middle East and Africa. And as we'll see in the kind of sub-lecture of this part of this unit, the medieval period was a period of significant oppression and persecution for the Jewish people. That really was the case throughout their history as a minority, pretty much always a minority community living in both Christian and Muslim lands. They were always vulnerable and subject to persecution, also as dissenters from the Christian message that definitely added fuel to the fire. You can see here the continuing spread, right, of Jewish populations in Europe. As Prothero notes, in the modern period, we see differentiation in the Jewish tradition and Jewish communities, as we often find in religious traditions, when religious traditions have to confront the challenge of secular life and modern challenges like science and um, political entities like the secular state, which really kind of take up a lot of space in the modern period. How much is the religious tradition going to adjust to modern standards? How much is it going to accommodate them, absorb them, integrate them, and how much effort is going to be made to protect the tradition and traditional ways against those modern influences? And in Judaism, like in Christianity and in other religions, you have a range from, say, Reform Judaism, which is probably the most accommodating of modern sensibilities, to Orthodox Judaism, which is really attempts to wall itself off as much as possible from modernity or insulate individuals who might have to go out there into the secular world, really managing very carefully their interaction with the secular. Zionism is another modern movement. That's a political movement and very much about recovering the return to a space where Jews can kind of organize their own community and have autonomy, as opposed to being a minority community, which is the lion's share of their experience throughout the centuries. Zionism is about establishing a homeland for the Jewish people, and that idea really got off the ground in the 19th century in Europe, and comes to fruition after the Holocaust, obviously, which we're going to be focusing in on as part of this unit in the course, culminating in the State of Israel in the wake of the Holocaust and World War II. The Allied powers, particularly the United States and England, ordain the establishment of the State of Israel as a homeland for the Jewish people. Obviously, this leads us up into a very troubled and controversial set of centuries. By the way, that's Theodor Herzl on the left, who is the founder of Zionism in Europe in the 19th century. And here you see a modern map that depicts Palestinian territories and the State of Israel in relation to each other. We know about the current conflict between Gaza and Israel. You can draw your own conclusions about how those myths that go back all the way to primordial origins in the Bible inflect or affect the geopolitical situation today. But I think you do have to note that the myth, the idea of finding a certain group of people in a land, right, and associating that group of people with a very ancient mythology that goes back to a very old original curse is something that would be easy to pick up on in thinking about the relationship between Israel, the chosen ones from a certain perspective, and the others who are in that territory. And we see the way that those ideas continue to play out to this day. If we turn towards practice within the Jewish tradition, which Prothero describes for you, I'll move quickly through a set of practices that are obviously really important for Judaism in maintaining identity. And like Islam, as Prothero observed, you might say that Judaism is very much a practice-based tradition, where beliefs maybe are not quite as significant as actually engaging in practice. And this might be even more the case for Judaism than Islam, because Islam, of course, has a set of orthodox beliefs that everyone should adhere to. But maybe a lot of their energy goes into practicing the five pillars and engaging in daily practice. In Judaism, one can maintain Jewish identity by simply engaging in practice, going to Passover or going to shul or going to the synagogue. And maybe one's beliefs are kind of in question, right? And yet one can still be considered part of this identity. So we might even have a case here where orthopraxy is even more important, right, than we found within Islam, as opposed to orthodoxy. If we move from, say, daily, everyday, right, activities through kind of different orders of time, we could probably say that prayer is the most kind of regular, intimate form of practice within Judaism. There are liturgical prayer services 3 times a day, but of course, people can pray at any particular juncture in a more informal way. And a crucial aspect of going to synagogue or going to the shul is a more formal means of prayer. On an everyday intimate level, keeping kosher every time you eat, which is a lot, is a remembrance, if somebody keeps kosher laws, of dictates that are found within the Torah. If we move up to, say, the weekly scale as opposed to the daily scale, we have Shabbos, right, or Sabbath, or Shabbat, which is weekly, the weekly kind of family or communal meal that happens on Friday night and goes through sundown on Saturday. And Saturday is often a time to go to synagogue and go to a service or go to study or something along those lines. It's to use the phrase of a Jewish luminary, it's a temple in time, right? If we move up to, say, the yearly scale, we want to think about the high holy days, Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, usually in the fall. Sukkot, the harvest festival. Moving into the winter and spring, Hanukkah, which is often paired with Christmas, obviously, but is, relatively speaking, a minor festival within the Jewish liturgical calendar, and Purim in the spring, which is kind of a Jewish version of Halloween. All of these practices are, of course, deeply connected to myths or injunctions within the Torah, within the Bible, which provide the mythic and lawful grounding of them. Passover, which is a commemoration of the Exodus story over a ritual meal in the spring. And really the complex of Passover happens through a period of a few days. If we move up to the lifetime scale, right, we have the bris for boys, right, the circumcision ritual, which is based in a biblical injunction. Girls receive a naming ceremony, which is roughly the parallel of this, of the bris. The bar or bat mitzvah, which is the coming of age ritual in Judaism. Marriage, of course. And then death rituals at the end of the life cycle. And Prothero expands on a number of these rituals, particularly those yearly ones, which plug into where practice throughout the year is directly plugged into mythic and narrative um, um, aspects of the Bible. So we'll leave this survey at that point. There will be another lecture, a shorter one, about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. I'm going to separate off that lecture just to give myself a break and to give you a break between these two different topics.